Well, anyway, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Jeff Meer, uh, and we're very pleased to have him here with us. He's the U.S. Executive Director of Humanity and Inclusion, HI in brief. He served in that position since the year 2015. HI works in 60 countries where there has either been natural or man-made disasters such as wars. They assist persons with disabilities and other vulnerable persons by helping them meet their needs and helping them obtain inclusion in society, such areas as vocation and education. HI has a special focus on disasters made by landmines and cluster bombs.
Just to set the stage a little bit for everybody's creation.
I'm not sure what year it was. It might be 1998. HI was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for its work on landmines. Before Jeff became executive director of HI, he was executive director of the he was actually special advisor for global health policy and development by the with the Public Health Institute. And before that, he served as the executive director of the U.S. Association for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So we're very pleased to have you, Jeff, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Tony, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm delighted that Maryland United for Peace and Justice has an interest in our work, and I'll spend a little while with you describing some of the background to a letter to the editor that was published in the Washington Post back in mid-2023, which is how Tony and I became acquainted. Tony saw the letter in the Post and he thought it'd make an interesting topic. And of course, we're continuing to follow the issue of Ukraine and cluster munitions through to today. We just incidentally, this is a very good time for this discussion because we've just passed the 2-year anniversary of that war. And so a lot of analysis and commentary is coming out now, and it's a really good moment to talk about it. So we have a pretty small group today, and I'm very happy to take questions at any point. You know, if it were a larger group, it probably makes sense to wait, but I'd say if you have questions as I roll through this, please do not hesitate to chime in. Since I'm looking at the presentation, I won't be able to see people, or so you'll have to just jump right in and interrupt me.
Okay.
I'm gonna go, can you all see the slide now that has the big hand and our mission statement? Great, okay, yeah. So it's working. So Tony went through most of this. Just to reiterate, we're about 40, let's say about 42 years old. Our organization was founded in the era right after the Vietnam War. Our founder, Jean-Baptiste Richardier, found himself in Southeast Asia, and he was surrounded by people who were injured by anti-personnel landmines and other unexploded ordnance. And he decided then and there that he was going to found an organization to help people with disabilities, and we continue to do that work today. And you might be asking why we're interested in cluster munitions and landmines. Well, unfortunately, as you probably know, these devices are injuring people at a prodigious rate, even to today. And we'll get to the statistics on this in a little while, but it's a sad fact that landmines, which had their origin in the 19th century, and cluster munitions in the World War II era, continue to kill and maim at a very prodigious rate. So there's a lot of work for us to do. So just to start out a little bit, for those of you who can see the screen, in the upper left corner, you're seeing a cutaway of something called an Honest John. This is a cluster munition that was used in the 1960s era, and it kind of displays what a cluster munition is. Unlike conventional artillery pieces, cluster munitions are either fired from airplanes or from artillery pieces on the ground in the sea. They explode not on the ground, but in midair. And when they explode, they release those little balls you see. They look like soccer balls a little bit, all over a battlefield or other area, usually the size of a couple of football fields. The one to the right is something called a BLU-3, and that was used largely in the Vietnam era. So in Laos, many of you are familiar with the secret war that the United States conducted in parallel to the main action in Vietnam. But in Laos, the US dropped about 2 million tons of these BLU-3s, which is about 270 million bomblets. Most of these still remain on the ground in Laos, and many of them are unexploded. So the US has a special responsibility with regard to Laos, and it's spending quite a bit of money these days to find the remaining remnants and clear them. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it's dangerous, and this is costing the United States to the tune of $250 million a year. These little bomblets can remain active for decades, and that's something that is not commonly known. The cluster munition is known to have a very high failure rate, or dud rate, for people who are not specialists, anywhere from 2% to 40%, depending on the type of cluster munition and the type of terrain that it lands on. We're going to get to some legal terms in a minute, but basically the idea is that if it lands on relatively hard ground, many more of them explode. If it lands, let's say, in a jungle or on soft terrain, fewer of them explode, and they remain, as I said, very dangerous for many, many years. This is a photograph of a young man from Afghanistan. His name is Ali. He's 9 years old in this photograph, and he was seriously injured by a US-made cluster munition there in 2020. The United States dropped cluster bombs in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2002. We dropped something like 250,000 bomblets, and of course, that's still, there's cleanup that is ongoing in Afghanistan, although it's been made more complicated by the Taliban regime, but it's still continuing. The reason I wanted to show this slide is that although there are military uses, some say, for using cluster munitions, the statistics show that more than 90% of all of the people who suffer either death or disability from contact with a cluster munition are civilians. Ali here is a kid, and he was out in the field just playing near to where his father is a farmer, and unfortunately he stepped on a cluster munition. His leg had to be amputated, and Humanity and Inclusion has been working with him since then at our clinic in Kandahar to provide physical therapy and, of course, ongoing work with his prosthetic leg. Let's see. Okay, so thank you, Tony, for mentioning the Nobel Prize that HI shared in 1997. We also became involved in an international treaty to ban cluster munitions because of the indiscriminate way that they harm civilians. They're dumb. Once they land, the little bomblets don't know if they're exploding the foot of a soldier or a child or an animal. They just explode. And that's the indiscriminate nature of it, along with landmines, is one reason why many, many countries believe they should be banned. And so in 2008, the world the United Nations adopted the Convention on Cluster Munitions. The United States is not a party to that treaty. And that'll come up again in a minute when we discuss Ukraine. But in 2022, about 1,100 people worldwide were casualties of cluster munitions, mainly in Azerbaijan, Iraq, Laos, of course, we mentioned already, Lebanon, Myanmar, the new name for Burma, Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen. Now, in 2022, HI took part in another really important global conference that dealt with the issue of exploding weapons. And this was a conference that took place in Dublin, Ireland. And a number of countries, including the United States, endorsed what came to be called the Political Declaration on the Use of Exploding Weapons in Populated Areas. So 82 countries thus far have endorsed this political declaration, which basically calls for special rules about using exploding weapons in areas where people are, civilians are. And so yet again, that has reaffirmed sort of the international framework around not exploding civilians. So now we're going to come to the US's own position on cluster munitions. Back in the days of, oh, I'm sorry, I need to advance. There we go. Here's a face everybody knows. Barack Obama played an important role. But what he did actually was he decided to continue a policy that George W. Bush had put in place, where the United States was going to slowly move toward joining the International Convention on the Banning of Cluster Munitions. President Bush had put us on a path toward that by actually prohibiting the Department of Defense from buying any new cluster munitions. They had been made for years by several US manufacturers, but as of the Bush administration, that was no longer the case. And the president, first Bush, then Obama, banned the sale of any cluster munitions made in the United States that had failure rates greater than 1%. And I think you remember just a few minutes ago, I said that the failure rate ranges from 2% to 40%. So it's virtually everything we've got in the cluster munitions area was banned. And then Congress, actually the Senate, in 2017 adopted Senate Resolution 897, which codified that and said that only in the case of national security, severe threats to national security, could the president authorize the sale or transfer of cluster munitions. So that was what President Obama did. And then came President Trump. President Trump, for reasons that only he knows, decided to change that policy. He canceled the George W. Bush policy and announced that the Pentagon would once again resume purchasing new stocks of cluster munitions. And they would still, of course, the law didn't change. So Congress's Senate Resolution 897 still applied, but the US slowly began to buy more supplies of cluster munitions from mainly non-US manufacturers and replenished our arsenal. Although we frankly haven't used cluster munitions ourselves since the Iraq War. Then Joe Biden came in, and President Biden hasn't actually changed anything. His administration hasn't bought any new any new cluster munitions, but they also haven't adopted the same stance that President Obama and President Bush before him had about transfer. And so, as you guys may remember, in 2023, the Ukrainian government formally requested that the United States transfer cluster munitions to Ukraine. was a long consultation and consideration of this. They weren't going to send them right away, but and an organization that I participate actively in called the U.S. Campaign to Ban Landmines and the U.S. Cluster Munition Coalition spent a lot of time lobbying the president and his advisors not to send the clusters. However, in July, President Biden decided to send the cluster munitions to Ukraine, and he announced that with some fanfare at the White House. He said at the time, the quote is, "It was a tough decision, but something we had to do." Honestly, what we believe happened is that the U.S. ran out of other kinds of artillery. And because we had so many millions and millions of rounds of cluster munitions at the same caliber, 155 millimeter caliber, the administration decided to start shipping cluster munitions. There were many within the Department of Defense that thought that this would be a game changer, that this would allow the Ukrainian military to more rapidly defeat the Russians. And of course, it hasn't worked out that way. So we don't know exactly how many cluster munitions the United States has transferred. However, just recently I was in a meeting at the Pentagon and I learned that the transfers are ongoing. President Biden, for his part, continues to want to supply arms of various different types to Ukraine in an effort to help them defeat Russia, which of course is invading Ukraine. And the sad fact is that both the Ukrainians and the Russians are both using cluster munitions. So that when this war finally ends, it's going to be a massive cleanup that will probably take decades. I mean, if we imagine what we're still dealing with in Laos, what we are seeing now in Ukraine could be an exact rerun of that. And we're, of course, for our part, Humanity and Inclusion, my organization, and a number of others are still continuing to actively lobby the Biden team to get them to change their mind. I also wanted to show a couple of images from present day Ukraine. HI is operating in Ukraine. We have a staff of about 250 people there. This is a photo of a woman in Kharkiv, which is, in the northern part of the country. This is a heavily polluted area, polluted by which I mean polluted with unexploded ordnance, including cluster munitions. It's extremely difficult to imagine how anybody could restart their efforts in farming, how kids could walk to school, how ordinary people could go to the market in an environment that is so heavily contaminated. And that, for that reason, I think a lot of people are not coming back. So what is HI doing? I mean, we're very, very engaged in Ukraine. We do something there that we do in a lot of countries, which is called explosive ordnance risk education. And what this really means is we hold meetings. You can see the woman in the upper right-hand corner. She's describing to students, in this case, what to look for, what the signs are of either a landmine or a cluster munition polluted area, and what an individual person can do to avoid getting blown up. Also involved in this is efforts to direct people to the relevant mine authorities in their town, in their region, or nationally, so that eventually these areas can be marked and cleaned up. We are also using drones with special equipment attached to them that can actually see from the air where explosive ordnance is lying. So it's a bit safer than actually sending around, as we used to in the old days, people with dogs or even mine detectors. but we can actually sense these bomblets from the air. And that's a darn sight better than we used to do. But of course, we also are working, as we do in, as Tony said, in about 60 countries with people with disabilities, either from contact with exploding ordnance or really any kind of disability. We do physical rehabilitation, we provide mental health care, we do emergency transportation, and of course, we distribute supplies so that people can survive. That's really the what I wanted to get through in terms of the presentation, but you know, I'm happy to answer any questions. I think that we're going to be hearing about Ukraine for a very, very long time, and HI is committed to being present in Ukraine as long as it takes to free it of landmines and to work with people who have been harmed by it. And we welcome the support of Maryland for Peace and Justice. We welcome support from anyone. Here's our website. And of course, Tony knows how to reach me directly. So very, very happy to be in touch with anybody from around here. Our US office is in Silver Spring. I live and work in Silver Spring, and so I'm local. I can come and address other audiences if you know of them who would be interested in this topic. We do work regarding cluster munitions and landmines in about 22 countries. So this is something we have long expertise in, and what we're doing in Ukraine is really taking the learnings from, oh, I'd say 41 out of our 42 years and applying them in Ukraine. So thank you very much. I think I'll stop there. Paulette, is that okay?
Paulette,
I think you're muted, Paulette. Yeah.
Paulette,
you're muted. Yeah, Paulette, you're muted.
Okay, Bill and Gloria, I have muted you. You have to unmute yourself. I don't know why they can't allow me to do that.
I unmuted myself.
Bill, you've done it. Now, Gloria, you're not muted now, Bill. You're okay. Gloria, I think you're going to have to jump off and jump back again, because I don't know if you know how to unmute yourself. And now I don't even know if you heard me or not.
Oh, well.
Paulette, can you see that Will has his hand up?
Yes, go ahead, Will.
Okay, you were talking about a legislative action. There's a Senate bill. I can't remember the number. Does that mean it was only passed by the Senate, or was it actually passed by both houses and then enacted into law? Because I'm wondering, weren't there provisions, if it was passed into law, weren't there provisions that kind of tied the hands of any administration?
It's a really good question, Will, and the answer is it was a companion bill was adopted in the House. It was merged with the Senate bill, and the president did sign it. But as I also said, it allows the sitting president, in this case, President Biden, to waive its provisions in the case of national security, and that's exactly what President Biden did. He just went ahead and waived the whole thing. Even though that bill says that any cluster munition with a dud rate greater than 1% is not eligible to be transferred, Biden waived it.
Wow. Okay. So basically, all they have to do is wave their hand, say it's waived, and that's it. Yeah.
I'm afraid so. And you know, that is not that uncommon. I don't know how much you spend time working on arms issues, but that is not an unusual provision. In almost every arms control agreement that we have at the level of the U.S. Congress, there's a provision for the president to waive it in the case of national security.
Well, and they can invoke national security over anything and not have to actually even say in what way it is. Could you at least give like what their what they're, I think if we want to do something about this, we have to really understand what the administration's arguments would be for this. Can you give a presentation on for example, why is it that they say that these are, in some cases, it's actually militarily necessary?
Yeah, well, that would be a interesting standard, but the standard is just, you know, the president has to decide that it's essential for U.S. national security. Now, why providing cluster munitions to Ukraine is essential to preserve the security of the United States would have to do with our role in protecting Western Europe, and I'm sure if we went back and looked at what President Biden said at the time, he would talk about the likelihood of a Russian attack against NATO allies if they were successful in defeating Ukraine. You know, you could devise such a statement. You could maybe even believe it, but of course the reality is that the Russians are not presently threatening U.S. national security directly. They're threatening the security of our allies, which by extension is us, but not the U.S. directly. My view.
So as far as you know, the Biden administration didn't even advance any particular arguments on why it was necessary. They just said it's necessary, and then they went ahead.
Correct. That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Well, it's hard to argue against a non-argument. Okay. Well, here, let me just go ahead and ask another question. You said you're in 22 countries. That's shocking that there are that many countries that still have to deal with landmines and leftover cluster munitions. Is in that 22, is that include like Sudan and Ethiopia? And are
does.
like were cluster munitions used in the most recent round of civil war that happened in Ethiopia? And then are they being used now in the Sudan civil war?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to those last two questions. I can research it and get back to you. What I can tell you is that there continue to be active sale and transfer of cluster munitions from a number of countries. We know, for example, that some of the cluster munitions that the Russians are using today in Ukraine actually originate not in Russia, but in North Korea. The North Koreans are continuing to manufacture cluster munitions. They're selling them like hotcakes all over the place. We believe that Iran is also manufacturing cluster munitions and selling them. And there are a number of states that have decided that the benefits of having cluster munitions outweigh the risks, and they continue to manufacture them. None in Europe, thank heaven, none in the United States. I mentioned the last manufacturer of cluster munitions was Raytheon, and they stopped manufacturing a couple of administrations ago. So, but there's plenty of them out there. There's no shortage of places to buy them. They're actively traded all the time, some of which we know about, some of which we don't.
Boy,
Thank you, but that's rather discouraging.
Yeah.
Well, the same is true of landmines, of course. Same is absolutely true of landmines.
Yeah.
And I bet also in Yemen, the Houthis using them, and whoever's fighting against them.
I'm not familiar with the use of landmines in Yemen for sure. Absolutely, that border between North and South Yemen is heavily mined. But I also want to make everybody aware of the fact that the United States itself no longer uses uses cluster munitions, but we do continue to use landmines in one place on Earth, which is the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. We have we have a treaty obligation that President Biden, like all presidents before him, continues to honor, that says essentially we will protect South Korea from a land invasion from the north. And one of the ways that we do that is by continuing to maintain, or helping the South Koreans actually to maintain, a landmine field as part of the DMZ. True fact.
Yeah, and if
Jeff,
they ever reconcile, that's going to be a mess. Not that it's
Right.
any time in the future it's going to happen, but
That's right.
eventually they're going to have a mess to clean up too. And these other countries, what are they thinking? Don't they know from the example of Laos that the cost is going to be way more than the benefit?
When the Minister of Defense of Ukraine came to make his case in Congress for U.S. cluster munitions, we organized for the ambassador of Laos to speak with him. And the ambassador of Laos told him in no uncertain terms that it was a huge, huge mistake for his country to use cluster munitions. And what, if I recall it correctly, what the Minister of Defense said, something like, well, if we don't have cluster munitions, there may not be a Ukraine. That was what his, his retort was. The fact
But it
is
really
that
doesn't
they
help,
know.
as you said. I mean, the Russians
know.
are still expanding. It's obviously not helping.
No, and the Russians use them too. That's unfortunately also true.
Well, if they do take over Ukraine, it'll be their problem, cleaning up the landmines and cluster bombs.
Indeed.
God forbid. Oh dear. Any other
Jeff,
questions?
Tony here. So I assume that the main delivery systems for cluster weapons are airplanes or possibly drones now. Is that correct?
That's an interesting new idea that the Ukrainians are pioneering. They're taking the larger artillery, the 155 millimeter artillery pieces apart, harvesting the little bomblets and attaching them to drones, and using the drones, flying the drones over Russian battlefields and Russian troops, and dropping them. That's a report that we have seen credible evidence of, but I've not witnessed it myself. It'd be a new use of the same old technology. But you're right, Tony, in the sense that most of the cluster munitions are either dropped from aircraft, fired from land, or sea-based artillery pieces.
Right. Did HI work in the Syrian conflict?
We are working in the Syrian conflict presently. We have operations both in northwest and northeast Syria, and demining is actively underway in both of those places. It's still, unfortunately, there's still conflict going on there, and it's extremely dangerous. So from time to time, we have to quit. But right as we're speaking, there's a team from HI that's in northwest Syria doing landmine clearance.
Okay. So Jeff, where does HI get most of its funding from? I mean, is it just individuals who contribute? Because to tell you the truth, before today, I don't think I had heard of your organization.
I'm not surprised, Will, and that's part of the reason why I'm with you today. It's my job to help spread the word, and I guess you could say I have a lot of work ahead of me. We are comparatively new in the United States. I became the executive director in 2015. We were established here in the US only in 2006. So we're relatively new in the United States. We're quite a bit better known in Europe. Our old name, which we don't use anymore, was Handicap International. And a lot of people from the early, let's say the early 2000s, or even the 20th century, they knew us by that name. So, but we've changed the branding, of course, because it's offensive to use the word handicap, especially for a lot of younger people with disabilities. So, but you're right. We are not extremely well known, except to the part of the U.S. government that funds in this area, which is the State Department's Office of Weapons Removal and Abatement. And I'm very happy to say that we receive between 8 and I think this year we'll probably have 9 separate grants from that office that help us with our humanitarian demining work. One of our largest programs we haven't even talked about is in Colombia, the country of Colombia. And there, the State Department, we have about 25 teams working in areas that were formerly mined by either the FARC or the government. And so but we do accept private contributions. We're a 501c3. We are very, very happy to have contributions from the public. We also get support, of course, from private foundations. But I think it's fair to say that in the United States, the main source of our revenue is the U.S. government. Very generous donor for this purpose.
I still remember the Nobel Peace Prize and always thought highly of that from many years ago.
Thanks a lot. We do too. You know, there aren't many people left at the organization from that era. That was way before I joined, of course. But it was a very, very proud moment because I think you'll remember that no one really thought we had an iceberg's chance to get that treaty done. No one thought at the beginning, all the major countries of the world, the powers of the world, all the Security Council members were all using landmines. Everybody was making them. And it seemed like an impossible dream, right? But it happened. And today, the number of countries producing and using landmines, especially among the NATO allies, is almost none. We're about the only ones left.
Sultan Sadson was a Georgian composer known for his chamber music as well as film scores. And
Okay.
All
All right. I don't know if Gloria heard me about dropping off and coming back on again. But if there aren't any more questions, thank you so much for your presentation and appreciate you doing this. And we'll see if some other groups might be interested in hearing from you as well. Take care.
Thank you, Paulette. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Gloria. Thanks, Bill. Really appreciate the opportunity, and congratulations to you guys for doing this important work right here in Maryland. I congratulate you too.
Well,
Thanks.
thank you, Jeff, and we'll try to spread the word about your organization.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye now.
Oh, by the way,
Bye.
before you go, are you guys,
Yeah.
are you doing anything or have any plans to do anything in Gaza? And are the Israelis using cluster munitions
right.
there?
We are in Gaza. We're in Gaza. We're in the West Bank. I have 27 staff in the Gaza Strip. I have 29 in Jenin, in the West Bank. That's a really difficult place right now. Last week, our headquarters office in Gaza City was destroyed. It was thoroughly, I have incredible pictures I could show you. It's very tough right now. We're having a grave amount of difficulty getting humanitarian supplies in there. My staff are under the gun absolutely every day. I spend most of my time right now worrying about whether they're safe or not. But thanks to some very generous private donors, we've been able to continue to at least do some of the work that we do. We're doing a lot of psychosocial counseling with children in some of the it's utterly hellish, actually. But yes, the short answer to your question, Will, is yes. We're quite active in Gaza. If you go to our website, it's all over our website, and it's a horrible, horrible situation. We all hope it ends very soon.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Jeff.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. Bye, folks.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
All right, so I'm gonna stop. Let me see, hold on a second. Just wanna stop the recording, but again, I'm completely, there we go. Let me try stopping the recording. I'll stop recording. Yes, I do.